Hi, I'm Molly. Sorry, I'm gonna have to angle myself a bit because I don't have notes and I forget the order of my slides. So I'm watching it with you guys. All right, we can start. This is an image of my studio back in Chicago. It's a fairly recent image. And I wanted to include it because I think it kind of encapsulates how I work, which has been interesting to translate into this residency. I tend to work on a lot at once. I would say most of these pieces are in progress. There are a few finished ones in the mix. But while I'm a sculptor who tends to make like discrete individual objects, they really kind of like come to fruition in series, and I think a lot in installation. So I'm pretty intentional about how they all sit in space with each other when I'm working on them. And then they tend to kind of like ping pong off each other, and color palettes and different like textural series arise. So even while these sculptures aren't, intended as a single body of work, when I go back through images, I can kind of tell what work was made in space with other pieces. I also have a really hard time speaking about recent work. It takes me a while to like digest what I'm working on. So these are all kind of question marks for me as well. We can go on to the next slide. This is the most recent iteration of a series I've been working on since about 2018, 2019 called Provisional Bodies. And kind of the seed question in this series is like what it means to build a new body. And it loosely started referencing the idea of the golem, which is a figure from Jewish folklore that is sculpted out of clay, mud from the ground, and then inscribed with the word of life, and it comes to life as a protective form. And then by changing a letter, it turns into the word death, and it dissolves back into the earth. So these sculptures were about kind of like a contemporary golem in a cityscape, where like, what does it mean to build a body in that kind of provisional, urgent manner, but with what I have available, which tends to be human-made objects. Next slide. This slide here is one of the provisional bodies. I made them the series started while I was in grad school, which was like a really difficult, interesting time for me, both kind of academically and personally. And it started at a time where I was like dealing with a lot of health issues and then also trying to like maintain my school presence. And there was a lot of like really complicated feelings around that of like urgency and rage, and then also just kind of like the humor of your body like falling apart in ways you don't expect it to do. So these early sculptures were all armatures that were made of objects from within my apartment. So this one is a duvet and twine and a little like metal fixture I found in my basement. And so I built these armatures and I'd bring them into my studio at school and encase them in handmade paper. I was trained as a paper maker. The majority of my work up until grad school was like primarily, if not all, completely handmade paper. So this was a time where I started to also like push out of my material comfort zone. This piece in particular, the like stand it's on is a chair that I broke apart that was sitting on my back porch and kind of rotted out throughout the winter. And what I loved about this piece is they mutually support each other. The chair leg can't stand up without the weight on top of it, and that flops over if there's nothing supporting it up. There's also like a little foil on the caps of the chair at the top that's from like a whatever those sodas are that you peel, or like seltzers you peel the foil off of. So that was my way to like add a little magical touch with like very utilitarian material. Right, next slide. This is one of my more recent provisional bodies. And what's happened as this work has kind of transformed is I think I'm less concerned with like hiding the interior through this paper and more kind of like exposing these inner mechanisms. And I think there's kind of like an incantation that happens with like the materials that I gather. I'm like a kind of material maximalist. And as people have gotten to know me and my friends have gotten to know me, people just give me objects now. I have like a little chain in there that was from a friend's like light fixture. When she moved, she took it out and gave me the light, and another friend's crate from his car. So materials from top to bottom. The top piece was actually a piece I made in grad school and then sat unresolved, but it's a broken chair back and a hospital blanket encased in handmade paper, sitting on a cinder block from my backyard, also covered in paper pulp with like a little mini sculpture in the middle there, which is a plastic cap and a little scrap of paper pulp that dried into like the sculptural form that I dipped in resin. And then there's a disc of resin and my friend's milk crate and a chain and a gourd that I dipped in resin and had started rotting out from the inside. So the next slide. This is another one of the more recent provisional bodies. The top is a plaster mold of some sort of gourd, I think, that grew on my friend's farm. It has like a little resin centerpiece, and then concrete foam covered in paper pulp, some discs that are sliced from a tree trunk in my parents' backyard, a little box I built that was mosaic tile from, I'm a gardener also professionally, so from one of my clients when they moved, they gave me all these tiles, and that's sitting on some furniture feet that I found at a thrift store. Next slide. Another one here with materials, another gourd dipped in resin, rotting out from the inside, metal post. All of those yellow pieces are resin casts of like a slice of a cow femur that I made a mold out of. So I like how they kind of, it's like one type of bone stacking up to create a different type of bone, like a spine, and then a concrete base covered in paper pulp on the top. So now shifting out of that series, this is a piece I made a few years ago called Living Room. I live in Chicago. A typical Chicago apartment has like this shaped living room if you're looking up at the ceiling. And I love to like lay on my floor and watch the sunlight change as the morning starts. And that particular apartment, instead of like a light fixture where there should be a living room light, just had like this decorative cap. And I always felt like where I laid down, it like could have just like dropped into my belly button. And I really liked that kind of like connection to the space and kind of started to think about that as like a portal as the light changed around it. So this is a resin cast of a different architectural feature from that apartment set into plaster, and then a frame built out of plywood and molding, and that's coated in paper pulp as well. And then kind of the belly button tangent. I really do like collect shapes and themes throughout my work. So I've done a lot of thinking about belly buttons, not so much as like what they physically are, I guess sort of what they physically are, but as like an orifice and a portal that's like kind of the forgotten part of our bodies. I think also like thinking about art history, as Lucy talked about, and like female bodies, there's a lot of sexuality, and it's like, what's like the least sexual orifice that we have is a belly button. So on the right-hand side is a paper skin from a previous cast that didn't work, and then I made a glass mold and like a glass cast of the bottom of an apple, and then took a picture of my own belly button and hydroprinted it onto that. And then on the left-hand side is like the first piece I made during lockdown when I was finishing grad school, and it was another chair back from my apartment. My roommates were not thrilled with me at the time. A flower pot and tights tied through, and then just like standing on those two plaster feet or concrete feet. Okay. Another shape that I'm really kind of in love with is milkweed pods. Again, like working as a gardener in the Midwest, which is like prairie land. Milkweed's like an incredibly important plant. And it also, like, I find, especially in the city, shows up at like really unexpected places in the landscape. And so on my walk to my studio at the time, kind of like in this dead space between the street and the sidewalk, there was this like stand of milkweed plants. And so I started, they kind of like, to me, looked like fingers sticking up into the air. So I started collecting them and dipping them in resin. And these are just kind of like two different presentations of that. But I also like, I think I'm a collector before I start making art. I'll go to the next slide. I think this is my last, is this my last slide? Great. This was made at a previous residency. And something that I've found, especially here, is that I have a hard time walking into an empty studio. And I tend to respond really like to my personal lived environment. So there's a lot of this, like in most of my work, there's kind of the anxiety overstimulation of living in a city. And as soon as I got here, it was like, I kind of expected, I usually start by like walking around and picking things up, and they're just like, there aren't like discrete objects to collect here. Like what Wyoming has is like space and landscape. So a lot of the work that I'm making now, I think has a lot more like balance and negative space, and I don't have any images of it. So I wanted to show this another moment of like trying to make work at a residency. And I was doing some like quick watercolors to get me started. And that was a watercolor sketch of like the crease of my legs touching, and just kind of thinking about folding and how like flesh touches and can create landscapes. So this was a little assemblage, and I think, yeah, I just wanted to finish on that. I think it ties into my other work very well, but I feel like each time I make work in a new place, there's kind of a new surprise to learn. This one was watercolor as object, and I think here I'm still figuring out space and balance. And that's it.